So welcome everyone. Nice to see many of you joining today. I'll just wait a minute or so as others still are joining. Great. So Rowan, if you're able to maybe pull up the slides and then I can get started. Thank you. Great. So welcome everybody. It's really nice to see so many of you join today's living wage consultation, which will inform WBA's new integrated transition assessment. Thank you for joining and welcome. I'm Charlotte Reeves. I'm an engagement lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance and will guide you through the session today. I'm joined by my colleague Rohan from the partnerships team, as well as Hiju from the research function, who will also contribute to today's session. So let's start by briefly running through the agenda, which will firstly introduce the thinking behind the integrated transition assessment before moving to how we situate the topic of living wage and income within it. And then there will be an opportunity to open the floor for questions and reflections. As it's quite a full group today, with obviously only an hour of our time, we also welcome you to use the Q&A to pose any questions, as well as the chat if you have any comments or reflections. But of course, during the discussion, we welcome you to come off mute and raise a hand so that you can take part actively. So why are we moving to an integrated transition assessment? As many of you may know, WBA has benchmarked company progress for almost a decade using the 7 system approach, which is that colourful wheel you'll see on the right-hand side. And we are moving to a one integrated assessment, which will cover climate, nature, and social issues while incorporating the impacts of AI. These issues are increasingly interconnected and cannot be addressed in isolation. So, for instance, credible decarbonisation cannot come at the expense of ecosystems, whereas also respect for human rights includes protecting the right to a safe and healthy environment. So we will continue to assess the 2,000 companies that have been in scope in our previous assessments and maintain many of the existing social topics that were part of our social benchmark, including living wage. But by moving to one universal framework, we aim to apply a more impact-orientated lens to show where companies stand from commitment through to delivery. And we hope by doing this, we will create a simpler and more streamlined approach with greater comparability over time. And in doing so, we hope to better define what credible corporate transitions look like. So to give you an idea of how we organise this assessment framework, on the next slide, you'll see the 3 main transitions that I've highlighted. So climate transition is very much in line with reducing emissions to the 1.5 trajectory, whereas the nature transition aligns, say, with the UN Global Biodiversity Framework and reducing impacts across water use, pollution, and deforestation. And for social, whilst there is no single defining framework, it incorporates respecting human rights, so very much in line with the UN guiding principles, and improving the lives of workers and communities, such as paying a living wage and income. Then on the next slide, we have the second organising axis. And this is looking at how we assess from intent to action. So we are developing and arranging our indicators that can capture company practices across planning, implementation, and performance. So with planning, that's more the commitments, the targets, the roadmaps, or governance systems in place. Then with implementation, we're looking at the processes, the monitoring, the resource allocation, and other actions. Whereas with performance, these are looking at the measurable impacts and outcomes. So on the next slide, I just wanted to give the group kind of a bit of a flavour of some of the topic examples within this matrix, and integration will be built through specific indicators that connect dimensions, such as, assessing kind of climate impact on workforce or consulting Indigenous people on land use, as well as in our scoring approach, which is being defined at the moment. So this could be through governance indicators, but also in kind of a scoring system that rewards more connected progress and doesn't kind of compensate for neglecting others. But why we are here today, now I've kind of given that broader framing. And if you have any kind of questions or thoughts on the ITA specifically, then you can kind of ask some questions in the chat or through the Q&A, and we can get back to you via email or after the session. But of course, today we're here for living wage and income. I probably don't need to tell this group why it's such an important issue, but we know that rising inequality is an increasingly urgent issue, with still around 1/3 of workers not earning enough for a decent standard of living. And climate and digital transitions really risk further deepening these inequalities. So paying a living wage is a practical and achievable action companies can take, and it is increasingly being recognised in global policy spaces, such as with the ILO recognition in 2024, as well as it being recognised in the EU CSDDD and referenced in the recent G20 report, and kind of in the evolving space of the TISFD standards. And then if we actually look at the evidence that we have from our assessments, our 2026 results show that there's a persistent gap and low performance. So kind of the headline finding we had that was that less than 5% of companies are paying a living wage or have a credible target that kind of outlines how to achieve it. But under this kind of more bleak statement, we did find signs of momentum. So since 2024, there were 47 new companies achieving a living wage, 185 additional companies meeting at least one benchmark element, and then this wider group of 214 companies that were signalling intent but just fell short of the benchmark criteria. I think another promising insight was that we saw an 167% increase in the uptake of companies reporting the data set or methodology that they were using to measure a living wage. So with this move to the ITA methodology, we really want to ensure that we capture kind of the full journey of a company moving from minimum wage compliance to stronger living, to achieving a living wage. And in order to do this, we want to better understand and reflect on some of the kind of key operational decisions, costs, and timelines that it takes a company to plan and understand, as well as how living wage objectives intersect with wider business and sustainability objectives, such as those issues around climate and nature. And in doing this, we aim to provide a fuller picture of where the world's 2,000 largest companies stand. So I will hand it over now to my colleague Hiju, who will be able to talk through the proposed indicators that we have and what we would love to discuss with you and get your feedback on today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte. So Charlotte has walked you through the ITA framework and where living wage sits within it. Now I want to share the proposed indicator we are developing, and more importantly, why we structure them this way. So just before going in, a few points to set the context. For food and agriculture companies, living income applies. So all our indicators are named a living wage / living income, and these indicators will be applicable for all 2,000 companies that we assess. Also importantly, living wage is one of the areas that we see a clear opportunity to move from the previous binary scoring, met or unmet, to a maturity based approach. So the data we can distinguish between companies at different stage of their journey on achieving 100% living wage. Also, for upstream high impact industry, we'll expand the scope to cover not only the own operations but also expand it to supply chain. So we've structured the living wage as 5 indicators along a pathway. And here I really want to emphasize this word pathway. So the goal isn't just to score companies, but we want this indicator to serve as a roadmap that helps the companies to progress towards living wage, to ultimately achieve the 100% of their workers. So each indicator capture a step in that credible journey. Now I want to go into more details of each indicator. So first one, under planning, we have a target. So does a company have a time-bound target for living all workers living wage or living income? And we, through our consultation, we also heard the first step could be the commitment, but we also want to expand that this is more of a time-bound target with set in stone timeline. And under implementation, we have 3 indicators. First is a gap measurement. So has the company measured the gap between what our workers are currently earning and what a living wage would be? So measuring the gap would be the first step in implementation. And the second is a determination. So how does the company determine what constitutes a living wage? So we, without a credible methodology, whether Anchor methodology, MIT living wage, or another recognized approach, company can't meaningfully assess whether it's paying a living wage. So we want the credible methodology to be used here. Another one, the third implementation, is activities and support. So here, does the company show evidence of concrete actions? This could include reviewing and addressing instances where workers are paid below living wage, adopting purchasing practices in the supply chain. So these are capturing those activities. And if we move on to the performance, we have achievement indicator. So has the company achieved the payment of a living wage or demonstrated measurable progress? So here also echoing the binary approach to maturity level approach, here we'll be able to capture if the company is disclosing the proportion or if the company is disclosing the year-over-year progress, and also the ultimate goal would be the achieving the living wage. And one key design choice is how we handle the scope of the supply chain. So living wage is inherently an upstream topic, and the challenge is graded in supply chain. So we would also love to get feedback on how we approach the supply chain aspects. And we can move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so before I move on to the discussion questions, I also want to emphasize that this is very much a work in progress, and we are sharing these proposed indicators precisely because we want your input to shape them. So feel free to raise any questions, any thoughts, whether you disagree or agree. A different perspective would really help us shape these indicators. The first discussion question is about the proposed pathway. So does the pathway reflect company progression? So we wanted to see our 5 indicators fairly reflect how companies actually progress on living wage from time-bound target to measurement and also to action and to achievement. So does this match what you see in practice? And yeah, wanted to hear if this is the right pathway that we want to create. And the second question is about the intermediate process or the full achievement. So our performance indicator specifically, because we had a binary scoring, it was either a company get a met or it didn't. And now we're proposing the graduated levels. Just briefly, it's disclosing the proportion and year-over-year progress or achieving the full living wage. Is this intermediate progress really meaningful to capture where the company is standing right now? And the last question is, what is there anything important that we are missing? What would make sense that these indicators, what would make these indicators more useful for your work, whether you're a company, investor, civil society organization, or working on a wage policy. So what we want to really open up the floor and also hear your thoughts on those questions, or outside of these questions are also very welcomed.
Great, thank you. And I see some hands raising. So Peter, would you like to take the floor?
Okay, so first muted and then unmuted myself and then muted. So here we are. Thank you for doing this, first of all. I think it's very, very important and a big step forward. I would just, if you go back one slide, first of all, on the planning stage, the time-bound target is in itself, I think it's good. It's in practical terms a bit hard, especially if you compare. There's still some discrepancies between which estimates should you use, which time should they be from compared to when were the wages paid. So maybe it would be wise to, if the company really wants to, I mean, they should set a time-bound target, but they also should have, you should introduce some indicators kind of steering the companies to really show that they have given this some thoughts and considerations. We are currently, I'm from AP2, by the way, and also sit in the management committee of the platform Living Wage Financials. Hi, everyone. I mean, I think this is probably a question for the ILO to really make a more clear definition of should companies be able to use like a 24-month moving average when setting the actual wage estimates used. So that would be the first thing. On the implementation part, I would strongly suggest introducing indicators that either increase the transparency on actual wages, or at least indicators that give, and this might be an investor point of view, but give some more clarity on like the percentage goal fulfillment. And also, are we talking about, and I saw there was a question in the Q&A, are we talking about own workforce, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4? How do you define your supply chain? And yeah, I think if you introduce indicators that kind of increase the transparency on that would be great. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Hiju, would you like to answer some of these now, or should we move on to Sally?
Yeah, I think we can move on to the next one, and I'll just try to answer.
Okay, great. Yeah. Hi, Sally. Are you able to unmute yourself and come in?
Sorry, it took a minute to work out how to unmute. Thanks for this. I'm really pleased to see this integration. I think it's super important to have this integrated approach, and it's obviously good to see living wages as central to your kind of understanding of the social aspect. Just to say, this is Sally Smith from the Anchor Research Institute. So I think for me, so I think from this perspective of the Anchor Research Institute, one of the concerns we have around the current approaches and some of the trends towards more of a compliance and regulatory approach is a lack of understanding that sometimes there's a very big gap to a living wage or a living income, and it's simply not feasible for a company by themselves to close that gap overnight, or often even in the kind of short to medium term, and that multiple different actors need to be involved. So I think your focus on progress is really, really important. But I would perhaps draw back a little bit from seeing, I mean, it's hard for me to say this, that we wouldn't want everyone to earn a living wage, but I think there's some potential risks involved with putting too much focus on achieving that 100% compliance. One of the risks is that companies switch their sourcing to countries with smaller gaps, and we've already seen this happen in some of the sectors where there is more pressure on the supply chain to pay a living wage, and we're getting a backlash from the producers as a result. Quite understandably, because producers and employers are being asked to pay a living wage, but the purchasing practices in the supply chain have not been adjusted to allow for that often. So that's the first thing I would kind of really encourage you to think more about measuring progress than measuring an absolute kind of compliance. Secondly, I would say in our experience, the time-bound target is actually not common. And I wouldn't say that's the first step. It is often a step that's taken by the more progressive companies, but we've seen some companies actually move back from that when they've realized just how difficult this is to achieve. So I think what we want to see as a first step is more about that commitment, but it doesn't have to be a commitment to all workers receiving a living wage. It should be a commitment to a company doing all it can to support payment of living wages and living income. And that's a very different thing. And that kind of brings me on to my third point, which is about responsible purchasing practices, which I think, you have a kind of neutral phrasing here of the activities that the company disclosing evidence of activities to further payment. The one key thing that companies can do is act responsibly in their purchasing practices. A lot of other things they can't do. They have less control over the national environment, the minimum wage levels, the macroeconomic factors that affect wages, and company profit margins, etc., etc. But companies do have control over their purchasing practices. So I think you need to give more weight to that. I would pull that out as a separate indicator. I would have, certainly more focus on that. I think then the last thing I would say is that, I really like that you've got this performance and looking at the achievement of what's being achieved, but again, broaden the scope for understanding what's being achieved, because some of the steps in the process are really important. So, for example, supporting collective bargaining agreements, supporting workers to organise and trade unions to negotiate with employers, etc., etc. And again, a brand or retailer has limited influence over that, but it can take action to that end, and through something like ACT, for example. That's a huge achievement in its own right, that has multiple different benefits beyond just payment, increased wages, right? So I think just being a little bit more nuanced in the language, and I understand that's hard because you're coming up with something generic, but I think it is about trying to focus on what really matters. Thanks.
Thank you, Sally. There's some really rich feedback already. So I think perhaps before we move on to Fiona, who's also got her hand up, we can take a pause here and reflect on some of those comments. Perhaps starting with the comments from both Peter and Sally on the planning pillar, and the decision to, or at the moment, the proposal to include the time-bound target. Because I know this was one of our kind of key design questions, Hiju, wasn't it, about starting with the time-bound target versus kind of a commitment. So yeah, would you like to share any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear the similar feedback between the different stakeholders. So there has been also the discussion under planning. I think the company, when they were to set the target, there was mainly two discussion. If the company is doing the gap measurement before setting the target, yeah, because it's in order to set the target, you would need to know where you're at between the gap. But when we look at the data, actually the gap measurement, actually measuring the gap within the company was achieved less than the time-bound target activity. So and then the measuring the gap was really credible step already in implementation. So we have divided these two actions and moved the gap measurement under planning implementation. And to your point on commitment, also there is a lot of internal discussions, but sometimes when we look at the commitment, it was more of it was coming from a policy, but really it was very simple statements that didn't verify any of the scope, or they didn't reference any of the methodology. So now we are trying to see if that could be maybe the basic step with the maturity level, even though it might not fully meet the time-bound target. Maybe with the maturity level, if we can capture those evidences under basic scoring with some guidelines, such as if they have defined the scope. So this is more than the statement that was provided in the policy document, So there's a few discussion around that, and I'm very happy to hear about the comments on the progress. Exactly what we wanted to, what we hope to capture with our indicators, and also when we had the company consultations, also received a positive feedback from companies because because the living wage is such a big topic and very difficult to achieve, and it's a very long journey. The company, I think, from company perspective, sometimes it was demotivating because they could, if it was a binary, they could put efforts, but still the scoring would be unmet. So when we give specific steps towards achieving our living wage, actually the company's feedback was very positive because they can initiate or they can reach out to different organizations and build that like brand partnership, and then still we will be able to acknowledge those efforts. So thank you for sharing that. And just quickly on the responsible purchasing practices, we also acknowledge that when we broaden the scope to supply chain, there's a lot more qualitative activities, and then there's a lot more partnership, and then the purchasing practice is one great enabling indicators or enabling actions that can help the living wage as well. So yeah, definitely we're keen to capture those currently under the activities and support indicators. And before I give it back to Shalom, maybe I can answer the Q&A question. So will the question from Chai Mei, will companies be assessed only on their own workforce, or will supply chain workers also be included in the assessment? This is a great question, and with our new indicator, we will have the maturity level. So the companies that, so it, the short answer is it differs by which industry you're in. But if the company have a great upstream impact, that industry will be assessed against the supply chain scope as well. So so it depends on which industry you're in, but if it's the impact is only on the own operations, then you'll be mainly focused on the own operation activities. So we are, so this will be the different maturity level scoring as well. Yeah, back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Hiju. Fiona, we'd like to welcome you in now. Thank you.
Can you hear me properly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. Sorry, this is complicated, like what Peter and Sally had. Thanks a lot for this. I just wanted to, first of all, reiterate, and I completely agree with both what Peter shared and what Sally shared. So I'm not going to repeat that. There's two other things that I think are very important to look at here. And that is that it would be good to ensure that the timing, the dates on which companies are comparing their living wages to wages, or living wage estimates to wages, is important if they mention that. Because what we see happening often is that they don't mention the living wage estimates that they've used from which time period, and to what time period they're comparing that to. So it's so we don't know if they're comparing apples with apples or pears with apples, right? So if we actually want to understand better which wages they're comparing with which living wage estimates for which time period, it would be good if they can disclose that. Or I think it's more relevant for all of us if they would disclose something like that. And the other piece, is about just reiterating the thing on what Sally has said on progress. I think it's very important that we look at how companies are progressing, because in general, I think we need to ensure together that we keep the momentum alive, right? You guys just said it in the beginning, the momentum is there, but I think the more positive we can be about the fact that companies make progress in this, the better, right? And not punish them on not meeting a living wage target at 100%. Also because living wages are a moving target, because we're talking about cost of living estimates, right? So, or at least cost of living bound negotiated wages. So that is something I think we need to ensure. One thing that I want to just be sure of is that there are quite a few guidance documents out there at the moment on how to measure credible living wage claims. I think that was made by IDH and ICIL recently. There are quite a few guidance documents out there on proper reporting on living wages, also those that are that the platform Living Wage Financials is looking at. So I just want to ensure that the indicators that you guys are preparing for this are in line with existing guidance from all these different institutions, including, of course, the ILO principles, right? So I think let's not reinvent the wheel together, but ensure that that it follows existing guidelines. The other thing that I think would be good to also mention is when you guys say they're reporting on credible living wage benchmarks, have you guys defined what that is? And there again, I would say refer to those that are and or either recognized within the IDH recognition process and follow ILO principles, right? So I think there again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So those few points from my side for now.
Thank you, Fiona. And I think starting on that point about that we want to show progress and build momentum is key. And obviously the data that we capture is able to kind of give an insight, a quantifiable number on progress. But then that's when we ensure that we work with other partners, many of you on this call, to kind of build that story and narrative. So we'll need more kind of contextual data or anecdotal evidence to kind of build that narrative and show that progress together. But I think that links obviously to what Sally said about more nuance in how we speak about achieving a living wage. And I know Hiju has mentioned about the maturity scoring, so moving from a met or not met to more of a gradient, and this is something that we're developing at the moment. But I think, yeah, your points on kind of broadening that scope and having a better understanding of what progress actually means is something that we're definitely going to take on board. And yeah, where possible, we always build on kind of the standards and frameworks that are out there. We don't ourselves define what is kind of a credible measurement tool, but more capture what companies are referring to, hence that we were able to give that insight on kind of the uptake of methodologies being used, and also we'll be able to kind of demonstrate which ones are being referenced. So you'll see the more prevalent ones versus not, but we kind of more hold that mirror back than defining kind of what credible actually means. Hiju, would you like to build on anything?
Yeah, similar to how Charlotte said, we don't prescribe a single benchmark, but for the determination indicator, we look whether the company use recognized methodology. So a lot of the names we hear, Anchor, MIT, Wage Indicator, Fair Wage Network, or others. I think the key is really the credibility and transparency of the methodology. And also to build our indicators, we have been closely following the guidance from IDH, ILO, also the guidance from the Shift So yeah, over